ever since my ranking video of all the engines from the classic series of Thomas and Friends, people have asked me when I'm going to do another ranking video. Well, today's the day, my friends. I know a lot of content creators use this ranking video probably as the low-hanging fruit, but I just decided to do it as well. I'm going to rank every Railway series book, number 1 to number 42, by both Wilbert and Christopher Awdry. But I do my rankings with a little bit of a twist. And because people were a bit confused about my rankings from the classic era engines episode, I'm going to let you in on my process. So I always start by watching or reading every episode that I'm going to review. I make my notes about it and I give it a score out of 10. I then collate every one that has that particular score, for example, a 5 out of 10, and then put those books in the order of which I prefer them. And that's how I come up with my listing. So I'm doing kind of the same thing with the Railway series books. I read through books 1 to 42 individually, write my notes, give a mark out of 10, and then I put it into an order based on my personal preference. And that is exactly how I'm going to do this ranking video today. So I'm not going to do the straight 42 to number 1 of what I think is best. I'm going to go through each book, talk about what I liked or didn't like about it, and then put it into a list at the end. That also means you guys have to stick around and watch the whole video. Okay, let's dive in. And we'll start with the Dalby era. Book 1, The 3 Railway Engines. It's the book that started it all. Without this book, we wouldn't have the other 41 books that followed it. We wouldn't have the 24 seasons and the plethora of movies from Thomas and Friends. This wouldn't be a franchise. So for the nostalgia's sake, it's a good book, but there are flaws. And I'm not saying it in a bad way. It was Wilbert's first book. His wife wouldn't have encouraged him to publish it, and the publishers wouldn't have published it if it wasn't good. But the fact that he had to write a 4th story at the behest of the publishers to get Henry out of the tunnel and link all of the engines together so they were all on one part of the island of Sodor kind of makes it feel like, you know, it wasn't really the original plan that we got for it. It's still a strong opener, and I give it a 7 out of 10. Book 2, Thomas the Tank Engine. Oh, I actually wanted to give this book a lower grading than I'm going to because it is so overhyped. It's the one that everybody gravitates to. It's the one that everybody talks about. It's the one that's been made into multiple adaptations, TV series, fan content, everything. But that being said, there's a reason why it's adapted into so many forms of media. Because the story's good. The character arc of Thomas is a complete arc. It's done really well. We still have the original illustrations, just with slight touches from Dalby after the fact. It really is a book that you can just pick up, show your kids, even just that one book, and if they don't want to read any more, they don't need to. Like Thomas, it stands on its own 6 wheels. I really couldn't give it any lower than a 7 out of 10. Number 3, James the Red Engine. Okay, everybody knows my bias about James the Red Engine, and this is actually one of the reasons why. His book is not good. Wilbert Awdry even admitted it himself. He was rushed by the publishers to meet a deadline. He rehashed Thomas's story. And if there's one thing that I really can't stand, it's a rehash of something. It is basically Thomas the Tank Engine, but with a tender engine in its place. The illustrations aren't great because it was Dalby's first one, but I try not to hold that against him because it was his first one. But the book itself was Awdry's third, and it was a major letdown from what the other two were. I'm sorry, 2 out of 10. Book 4, Tank Engine Thomas. Again, go and watch my Railway Reviews episode on Book 4 and you'll understand why I do not like this book. It's not as bad as the one that I've just discussed previously because it's original stories. We get some new characters such as Terence the Tractor and Bertie Bus, which expands the world of Sodor, but it just is Tank Engine Thomas. Again, they just went, okay, we struck gold with this little guy. You've got to write more stories about it. And it felt like it was more done out of obligation rather than actually trying to think of something decent. But I do give Thomas and Bertie a bit of a pass when it comes to my gradings because this was one that Awdry went through with his kids to make sure it was realistic. He would go through the race sequence with them, and if they thought it couldn't be realistic for Bertie to be winning at this specific point, or wouldn't there be a signal or a level crossing blocking them at some point, he would add it in. Didn't want to pander to them. But that being said, it's not a good book. 4 out of 10. Book number 5, Troublesome Engines. I go against the grain with the fandom of this one because I love this book. I love the politics of the engines on Sodor, and this brings it to the forefront. The Tender engines have superiority complex over engines like Edward and Percy and Thomas. They believe they are above shunting, and the Fat Controller royally puts them in their place. I loved it. I loved that it didn't need to be constantly going outside of the realms of the sheds for it to have an interesting plot and an interesting story. And yes, we get Percy runs away, so we get his little introduction and his sequence around it too. And Percy is my favourite character. So for me, 8 out of 10. Book number 6, Henry the Green Engine. A really good book. One that really cemented that Awdry was going to take his writing seriously. Up to this point, we all know what the deal was with Henry. He was going to write him out because of bad illustrations, and he didn't think he could do anything with the character. That's why he was ill in the previous books. But instead of doing that, he listened to his audience. They wanted Henry to get better. They wanted Henry around, and he created stories that made sure that he got to be kept in the guise that he was wanting from there on out. My only issue was having the random Percy in the scarf story. There was no point to it, otherwise to highlight the fact that Percy was still around. Again, an 8 out of 10. Book number 7, Toby the Tram Engine. I love this book. I love the character of Toby. I love this iteration of Toby. It's why I get so annoyed with how the TV series have butchered Toby's character, because he's no longer the wise old sage. It's got a bit of an edge to him, but it's really solid and shows the vein of form that Awdry was starting to come into with his writing. 8 out of 10. Book number 8, Gordon the Big Engine. Another banger of a book. The stories knit nicely together. It's a good arc for Gordon. He's proud. He has a fall, literally and metaphorically. He's got to work his way back into the good books, forms an alliance with Thomas, and becomes a wiser engine as a result, even though he's still got a bit of that cocky attitude. Even the illustrations in this book, I would say, were really solid. There were some illustrations in the previous books that were a bit hit and miss for me. This is one where I could say the illustrations were pretty rock solid. It seemed like Dalby had really figured out what he wanted to do with them at this point. 9 out of 10. Number 9, Edward the Blue Engine. Yes, there's the whole thing about it's called Edward the Blue Engine, yet he's a side character in his own book. But I think that was the point. Edward isn't a character that would crave the limelight, even in his own book, because we all know the world of Sodor Railway Series books exists in its own universe. So I would imagine if Edward found out there were books about him, he wouldn't want the spotlight. He would be happy being the secondary character. But all the incidents still revolve around him anyway, his age, that people think that he's washed up and old iron, and him rising to the occasion and proving everybody wrong. That is Edward, to a T. We get the idea of scrapping brought up for the first time. We get a new character introduced in Trevor the Traction Engine. The only issue that I have with the book is the fathers walloping their boys soundly for the incident with James. But I understand that's just of its type. 9 out of 10. Book number 10, Four Little Engines. This one started off the Skarloey Railway, and while I enjoyed it, not the best. Not bad, I'm just not a big fan of the illustrations of the little engines, and the fact that it's basically rammed down our throats that we should all be visiting the Tallyclin Railway just because Awdry says so. It's a brilliant railway, and there are great steam engines there, but it did just feel like it was too much exposition dump for me. I know we need it to establish these new characters, but it was a little bit too much. Am I the only one that found it ironic that they're all paired up with their 3 railway engines equivalents? Skarloey is paired up with Edward, Sir Handel meets Gordon, Peter Sam is a story with Henry. Don't know if it was intentional, but I like to think it was. Awdry was quite methodical that way. A strong start, but again, like its 3 railway engines book, 7 out of 10. Book 11, Percy the Small Engine. This is a solid book. It's really strong. It gives you more insight into a character that's been buried in since the 5th book in the Railway series. We've had our time with Percy, we've got to see him about in little bits and pieces, and now he finally gets the spotlight to himself. I do understand about the criticisms with the illustrations, but I think that was down to Awdry just constantly belittling Dalby. There's only so much criticism you can take when you're trying to do a creative vision, and the person that's wanting the vision done doesn't really give you any leeway. I understand that Awdry was meticulous, but Dalby would be trying to do a good job, and the more criticism that you get, the more it's going to affect the final product. But the stories themselves were absolute bangers. 9 out of 10. And now we move into the Kenny era, with book number 12, The 8 Famous Engines. It's a step up in the illustrations, I'm not going to lie. I like Dolby's illustrations. I think they were perfectly suited for what the books started out as, but as the books are evolving and continuing to grow, we needed an illustrator that could match those demands. And John T. Kenny clearly fit that bill. They're 4 stories that don't really link in with each other, but overall they're good. We also get to see characters such as Gintate and Pug, which are Railway series exclusive. And I do like how Thomas's crash is portrayed in the book compared to the TV series. I feel like the crash in the final book, when it was adapted to TV, was sensationalized because it was the 100th episode, whereas this one was more realistic. The step up was being made in all counts. 8 out of 10. Book number 13. Duck and the Diesel Engine. I love the illustrations, I love the story, I love the character of Diesel, and I do like the fact that in one of the stories the bad guy wins. Diesel won against Duck. He turned his colleagues against him. He got him shunned and sent away. And I know that the one line of dialogue about how Diesel got his comeuppance because he was found out telling lies about Henry and then got sent packing is just throwaway dialogue, but it was more dialogue than we got in the TV series. In season 2, the Fat Controller just says, "I never believed Diesel, I sent him packing." You get a lot worse explanations than what we got. 9 out of 10. Book number 14. The Little Old Engine. Another solid Skarloey Railway book. I feel like the Skarloey Railway stories got better as they went on because there was less exposition dump and more character development. And that was Awdry's style overall when it came to the Railway series books. Start off with a heavy exposition dump about a character or characters and then start building on the lore of it. And this really is the start of it. We're getting introduced to some more characters, find out a bit more about their time on the railway, and it's a great little book. At this point, I was still preferring to read the standard gauge engines than the narrow gauge engines because there was no basis of, come to Tallyclin. The standard gauge engine stories stood on their own merits. The Skarloey Railway ones were purely just to boost Tallyclin. I didn't like the favouritism. 8 out of 10. Book number 15. The Twin Engines. Donal and Dougie, sir. Scottish engines. Cannot beat them. Practical, peppy, not afraid to take any BS from the other engines. I know there's a lot of stuff about the missing coach. I have done a video on it if you want to check it out, but it is the missing coach that ironically gives it lesser numbers for me. The more you read it, the more you realise that it is just completely stupid what they were doing. Well, it's still great, and the resolution and the deputation is great. 8 out of 10. Book number 16. Branch Line Engines. Is it just me that's the only one that's not the biggest fan of this book? I don't know, I just felt like this one was a bit of a downgrade. It was just back to, what's life like on the branch line. We get the introduction of Daisy, and I much prefer her in this than I do in the TV series. But I don't know, something just didn't really sit too right with me. I'm not as big a fan of the TV adaptations of this book, so maybe there's a little bit of bias towards it, but I still enjoyed it. I give it 7 out of 10. Number 17. Gallant Old Engine. It's the little notches of improvement with the Skarloey Railway books. With every book that you read about them, there's always a little something that's added to it. Another special ingredient to the Skarloey Railway soup. The world keeps building. We get new characters. We get less of Tallyclin rammed down our throats. And we just get to enjoy the stories for what they are. Stories about the Skarloey Railway. 9 out of 10. And we move into the Edwards era. Book number 18, Stepney the Bluebell Engine. These illustrations scared the crap out of me when I was younger. Like with the previous era of illustrations, they were moving on with their audience and they were showing darker and grittier themes. So they had to have a darker, grittier illustration. And boy, some of these ones still give me nightmares. The book about Stepney is fine. I enjoy it. I think it's mainly the illustrations that really boost my enjoyment for this. The stories are fun. They don't have much of a link. It's just Stepney comes to the island of Sodor for a little bit, has a couple of adventures, leaves again. But I thoroughly enjoyed it though. I love the fact that it was a real engine that came to Sodor from the other railway. And I do find it interesting that on the other railway, their smoke boxes don't have faces. Then when they cross over into the Sodor territory, they do. I'm not saying that there's any magic involved with this type of thing. I don't know what it is. It was never really explained. It was just something that I noticed. Still great though. 9 out of 10. Book number 19, Mountain Engines. I love this book. I love the stories. I love the illustrations. I love that it's characters that we've never seen before. And I also love the fact that it's characters that we never see again. It's such a singular experience. Kind of like what the second book in the Railway series is with Thomas the Tank Engine. But it's not tainted by oversaturation of commercialism and marketing and all that crap. It's just there. It's a book that is completely untouched by TV series lore. There's nothing else to compare it to. It's its own book for what it is. Absolutely fantastic. The stories all link into each other. There's some really dark themes in there. The illustrations are bloody brilliant. This one, 11 out of 10. Book number 20, Very Old Engines. This is the rich vein of the form of the Railway series books. We're getting the backstory of Scarlowe and Rhaenys. There's only a little bit of Tally Quinn involved because of the 100th birthday celebration, but the backstory is so good. Again, it's so dark, so gritty. The writing has evolved considerably over this time. I love seeing Scarlowe in his younger days. I loved seeing that he was a prick, yet he grew up to being the engine that he is now. I love the fact that he and Rhaenys never got on to start with. They didn't like each other, couldn't stand each other. And now they're like brothers in wheels. It's such a fantastic book. It's totally separate from everything, kind of like what Mountain Engines is. There is one bit of media to compare it to, though. Egmont Publishing did bring out like a Thompson Friends library series, and for Scarlowe, did adapt a couple of these stories from it. Bit watered down, more kid-friendly, but they were still good stories. I still read them to my boys at bedtime. A 10 out of 10. Number 21, Mainline Engines. Another great book. The introduction of Bill and Ben and Boko. The introduction of a friendly Diesel, rather than all the arseholes that we've seen. It also rounds off with the cocky prick character of Gordon more effectively than it had done, ironically, in his solo book. And it's just nice to have this little period where every book is just of superior quality and excellence. Edward's Exploit, beautiful, fantastic. That being said, when you go from reading Mountain Engines and Little Old Engines to this, as a downgrade, still great, but just doesn't rank as high for me. 9.5 out of 10. Book number 22, Small Railway Engines. The Arsedale gang. Just add that little bit extra to this burgeoning little western railway. We've got Duck, we've got Donald, we've got Douglas, and then we've got the Arsedale trio. Their stories are great. I know a lot of people don't like them as much, but I still love them. I love the fact that up until the 20th season, they were untouched, and we just got to enjoy them for what they were. And I was so excited when they came out in the 20th season of Thomas and Friends, but I still preferred the originals. They're not without their faults, and some of the illustrations are a little bit creepy, but I can't not give this any lower than 9.5 out of 10. Book number 23, Enterprising Engines. We're back with quality and back with a bang. The only thing that I really wish was that Edward's Exploit was in this book, because they covered Gordon in this, they covered Henry in it. If they covered Edward as well, you would have had all three of the original 3 railway engines getting spotlight stories in this book. There would have been a nice symmetry to it. You had the introduction of Bear, the diesel engine, another diesel engine that proves that not all diesels are pricks, and he's in awe of engines like Henry rather than thinking that he's superior than them. That's the kind of way that you really want like the younger generation to look to the older generation, to respect them for what they've went through. And I think there was a lot of that in this book. Escape with Douglas and Oliver and Toad and Alice was such an amazing story. It's tense, it's gripping, it's a feel-good story. 10 out of 10. Book number 24, Oliver the Western Engine. I know this should have been called the Little Western Engines, but it wasn't. I understand why though, because there's only 2 stories that are really Oliver-centric, but he is involved in Bulgy, so 3 out of 4 ain't bad. We get the introduction of Bulgy, who's a true road rebel. Some of the illustrations on here, especially when Bulgy is completely wrecked, is fantastic, and it's a great character arc for Oliver, and a progression of how Awdry was able to condense the character arcs now. It used to take him a full 4-story book to do a proper character arc for an engine. He's now halved it and done it in 2, but still has that quality that we all know he has. Just shows the writing skill in him. 9.5 out of 10. Book number 25, Duke the Lost Engine. The book that was originally meant to end the series. Whether I believe it should have stopped there or not is quite frankly irrelevant. I do have my own views, but it doesn't matter. We got what we got. But everybody would have been fine with this ending. It felt like the grand finale that Awdry was building up to. It's great seeing those little bits of backstory and Easter eggs that he's put in the rest of the books finally come to fruition, and we get everything that we want, and the payoff is extremely satisfying. It's such a great book. We all love Duke. We all love the story behind it. 10 out of 10. Book number 26, Tramway Engines. What wound up being the final book of Wilbur Awdry's reign. And it's a downgrade. I'm sorry. Considering what we could have got as a finale, and then we get this one tacked on because of publishers saying, nah, he's another one. I felt so bad. It felt like Awdry had an idea of 2 stories that he wanted to do, and then publisher said, oh wait, there's no Thomas in this. We need 2 stories that have Thomas in it. I'm not as big a fan of Ghost Train and Woolly Bear as everybody else is. I'm just not. I don't think they were needed. The Mavis ones are great, especially the Mavis and Toby dynamic. It's fantastic. And knowing that Daisy was the original role that Diesel had in the series 3 episode of Mavis made more sense. It was like a us girls got to stick together thing rather than us Diesels got to stick together. It's still a good book, and I still love the 2 Mavis stories, but it just took the shine off it for me. 8 out of 10. And that's all the Wilbur Awdry stories. Let's jump in to the Christopher Awdry stories. Before I start Christopher Awdry's reviews, I want to make it clear that I know that they are seen as a downgrade compared to his father's work, but I still enjoy these books. I enjoy all the Railway series books. It doesn't mean that I don't see flaws in them, but you could tell that with Christopher's style, it was more a case of we have a target audience now, kids and maybe young adults at a push. Publishers wanted to stick with that. I think Christopher wasn't granted the same freedom as his father was, and I think maybe that's what hampered some of the stuff that he's done. And I've tried to take that into account. I also know that Clive Spong isn't everybody's preferred illustrator, but I do like him. His colours are more vibrant. We kind of go back to that Dolby style of illustration. Again, these are my rankings and it's my list. So let's start with book number 27, Really Useful Engines. This is going to be controversial. I think that the first book of Christopher Awdry's reign is better than the first book of his father's reign. I really love these stories. I especially love Triple Heather at the end. The first 3 stories are all about the main tank engines, Thomas, Percy, Duck. And then they all come together for one climactic story. Again, similar style to 3 Railway Engines. His father didn't have any other bases than the stuff that he wrote himself. But Christopher was a big influence on the work that his father had, so he had something to base it on when he started doing his own writing. The illustrations are bloody terrifying, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the overall quality of the stories, in my eyes, are better than his father's first book. 8 out of 10. Book number 28, James and the Diesel Engines. Now this is where Christopher's writing differs from his father's. His father seemed to have a steady upward trajectory of getting better, with the slight dips every now and then. Christopher, it seems to be he has a strong book, and then there's some duds, and then there's a strong book, and then there's some duds. You get the idea. And this is the dud. The premise of James and his prejudice against diesel engines is a fascinating one. And the idea of the final book where he is converted round to liking diesels by a diesel engine who has helped him out of a situation has promise. The way I would have done it is this. Old Stuck up first, and then the final book is the start of a 3-story arc between James and this diesel engine that's come to help him when he's broke down. And it covers the journey back for James to get repaired. Maybe there's a couple of exciting incidents in between that cause James to not like the diesel engine, maybe causes some more injuries or more accidents to James, or maybe James has to use his own quick wit and thinking to save a diesel from causing any other accidents. And over the course, you get more of a story-heavy thing about why James doesn't like diesels in the first place, and they come to kind of a reconciliation at the end. But we got what we got, and I just think there was squandered potential. I don't think it was Christopher's fault though. I'm just sticking the blame at the publishers for this. 5 out of 10. Book number 29, Great Little Engines. I think, again, Christopher's work is unfairly compared to his father's. And I also think that's very true with the Skarloey Railway. Wilbur had a clear love for the railway because, we got Taliclan rammed down our throats in all these books. But he built the lore, he got us invested in the characters, And the last Little Engine book that we had was about Duke the Lost Engine, and it was just such a high to go out on. This could have been the best work ever written by Christopher Awdry about the Little Engines, and it still would have fallen flat. It's such a massive come down. I don't think the stories are as bad as everybody makes them out to be. We're just in a different era of the Railway series books now. It's clearly not marketed for all age groups, it's marketed for a specific age bracket, and it just shows. 4 out of 10. Book number 30, more about Thomas the Tank Engine. So even the fact that the title is basically Christopher's version of Tank Engine Thomas again, I actually prefer these stories to the stories in Tank Engine Thomas again. I gave these stories a lot of unfair criticism because they weren't adapted as well into the TV series. But reading the books and the stories themselves, I think they're so much better, and it's because of the conflict with Thomas and Percy. They have a conflict at the start, they're not on the best of terms throughout the stories, and then it ends with them kind of patching things up. I know it's not really addressed in the 2 stories in between, but you know that there is a divide there, and this is what's affecting Thomas's mood in the 2 stories afterwards. And I just think Drip Tank would have been a great adaptation into a TV series. If he was making a book that was meant to tie into the TV series for 4 stories, use every story in the book. 6 out of 10. Book number 31, Gordon the High-Speed Engine. Here we go. Here's some of the Awdry magic that we know is in there. I think you can tell with Christopher's writing where some stories he's being pushed to write by publishers and ones he wants to write because he has a story to tell. There's more passion to it. There's more weight and expectancy. And this is definitely the case for Gordon's book. He is now entering the twilight stage of his career. He still wants to prove that he is relevant and useful, but he also doesn't want to do himself in and cause more problems by doing that. And this is a different Gordon at this point compared to the Gordon that was around at this time in Wilbert's run. So it is like 2 completely different engines. And I just love the fact that even though Gordon wins the day, you just have that uneasy feeling that it's not over. You don't know when it's coming, but you know that the other shoe is going to drop. 9 out of 10. Book number 32, Toby, Trucks and Trouble. Man, the alliteration took me a couple of goes to get that right. I really like this book. It's not as good as Gordon the High Speed Engine, but again, it's another character you know that Christopher wanted to write about and tell more stories about. Toby is a character whose personality doesn't really change in the books, but it doesn't need to. Toby's already the lovable old curmudgeon when we first meet him, and it's fine that he stays that way. That's the best way for him to be. And I do like we get a bit of backstory towards him, finding out about his younger days. I do wish that we had more backstory towards Toby. I think more Toby-centric stories from his past would have been great, but they obviously had to have some sort of kind of break up in between, and then his most infamous character of Bulstrode is introduced in this book. Overall, pretty solid. 7 out of 10. Book number 33, Thomas and the Twins. An interesting pairing, Thomas, Bill and Ben, because they are all pricks. I felt sorry for Edward in this book. It must have been like running a nursery for him. You've got Bill and Ben, who obviously tag team on Thomas, phrasing, because he's a newcomer to their patch and they just want him to suffer. But because they're all such pricks, the chemistry just flies off the page. It's great. It's one that you can just have a right giggle about. I loved scrambled eggs. I loved the dip. Consistent quality in these last few books. 7 out of 10. Book number 34, Jock the New Engine. Yes, I know there's continuity issues with this book. If you don't know what these continuity issues are, I will find a video that explains these and put it in the description. But overall, a great addition to the Arsedale Railway. We also have some of the best meta humour since Wilbert's run, because they have a diesel engine called Frank, who was around at the time the books were getting made, but he never got put into the books, and he's absolutely raging. Fantastic. And I do like that each Arsedale engine gets a story to themselves in this book. Obviously paired up with Jock at some points, but it's done great. Jock's character is very well established. I just wish we were able to get more of him. Further illustrations. 8 out of 10. Book number 35, Thomas and the Great Railway Show. This is kind of like how his father was constantly advertising Taliclin, but condensed into one book. It's there to promote the Great Railway Show in York and the National Railway Museum. We don't get some of the bigger engines that were there at the time, but that being said, we still get Rocket, we get Mallard, we get Green Arrow, so I wasn't exactly complaining. Stories themselves were alright, bit of a dip from Jock the New Engine, but overall not bad. And I do like the fact that in this they are now acknowledging the fact that Thomas is old. Thomas is older than Gordon. He's older than Henry. He's older than quite a lot of them, bar Edward. So they finally admit that Thomas is the old one and he should be going to a museum. It was a nice in-joke. Good on you, Christopher. 7 out of 10. Book number 36, Thomas Comes Home. Why is it called Thomas Comes Home? He is literally only in the last part of the final story. I know this is covering everything that's happened while he's been away at the Great Railway Show and all the stuff that's been going on in his branch line, but they couldn't have thought of another title. I know Thomas, marketability, all that stuff, but come on. We'd had ones like Jock the New Engine. We'd had Toby Trucks in Trouble. We'd had Gordon the High Speed Engine. And they must have sold all right. But again, it's publisher's wish. But it doesn't take away from the fact that these stories are really good. I thoroughly enjoyed them. Some of them I think could have been good TV adaptations. Like I say, the title is the only gripe. 8 out of 10. Book number 37, Henry and the Express. I really enjoy this book. I love the Henry and James dynamic. This was something that Christopher really played about with in this era. A pairing that you didn't necessarily know you wanted, and then once you realised how good the chemistry was, you wanted more of it. I loved their back and forth during this. I love the fact that you're taking something as mundane as Henry going to get yet another overhaul, just not as much as what it was when he was at Crewe, and just make some stories out of it that are genuinely entertaining. Or the fact that one of the duties James has got to do when Henry is away is pull the flying kipper, and he absolutely hates fish. Only way that could have been better is if they somehow made Thomas do it instead. 9 out of 10. Book number 38, Wilbert the Forest Engine. Really, Christopher? How could it go from being so good with this nice vein of form that you were on to just all of a sudden drop? This book gets unfairly compared to Stepney the Bluebell Engine because it's a real life engine that visits the island of Sodor. But that being said, it is still inferior. I do love Cab Over Wheels. I think that's a great story. But ironically, the best story is the one where Wilbur isn't actually involved. I know that Percy's Porridge was a creative writing exercise that was done with some kids in a primary school, and the story was based off of it. Some of the illustrations with Percy, the porridge on his face, they just look so wrong. If you're fans of my humour, you'll know what I mean. I just feel so bad. He was on such a great vein of form and it just dropped like a stone. 3 out of 10. Book number 39, Thomas and the Fat Controller's Engines. This has been covered in other videos about the Railway series books, that this book was released to celebrate the Golden Jubilee, and there was absolutely no mention of it until like a couple of pages in the last book and a couple of lines of dialogue in the first book to loosely tie them together, but the rest of the stories were just and I shouldn't feel that way about a Railway series book. I love these books. I just feel really, really bad. It went from him having his little purple patch of everything going well with the stories. They weren't exactly firing out on all cylinders, like, you know, in the 10 out of 10 marks, but they were good stories compared to what was being fed to us before. And then we get the previous one, and now this. I hate to do it again, but 2 out of 10. Number 40, New Little Engine. I really didn't want to have the same ranking as The Unlucky Tug with this. I didn't want to think that this was a bad book. I watched that review and thought, he's being a bit too harsh. Maybe I'll go and read it. And yeah, I do still enjoy the book. I'm sorry, again. Oh, it pains me to do it, but 2 out of 10. Book 41, Thomas and Victoria. A slight upgrade. I like Victoria. I like the carriage. I like the backstory for her with her original engine. I like the fact that she becomes part of Toby and Henrietta's train. I enjoyed it. One thing that I did notice was people saying, oh, she's been behind that bush for 50 odd years. Why is she only speaking up now? It's a bit redundant. Do you guys not remember Glenn the Coffee Pot in Series 20? For anybody that isn't aware, let me break this down. The release of the adventure begins, and at the end, we saw Glenn the Coffee Pot engine, who was the original number 1 on the island of Sodor in the CGI timeline before Thomas took over. And then, in season 20, Marion thinks that she's talking to a magic tree, and it turns out that it's Glenn that's hiding behind there. And he basically just let, everything grow around him until he was found. And he was only found by speaking, just randomly one day. Stone used this thing with Victoria as a reason to put the book down. We've had Glenn the Coffee Pot engine in the same type of vein as this. We had Hero and Hero of the Rails in the same type of vein, where he was stranded for a long time. It took Thomas crashing through the trees to actually find him and for him to speak. It's been done before. It's not an unbelievable trope in this type of universe. Stop trying to pick holes in it where it's not there, because there's holes that you could pick in multitude of stories in this book. So just that's the one I really had the gripe with, because I did enjoy this book. It's not as good as the ones I'd mentioned previously, but it's not bad. It's perfectly in the middle. 5 out of 10. Book number 42.
Thomas and his friends.
If it had ended with Thomas and Victoria, I would have been fine with it. They're great, but it wasn't the worst. He was on a bad run of form at the time. We get this book, and while the Gordon storyline is resolved pretty well, that is about it. The Donald and Douglas story is just buffer bother with Bill and Ben in season 6. I don't like that story, and I don't like this one. It does end with a nice illustration of a bust of Wilbert being unveiled. For that, I've got to give the dues. And we get to see a bit of Gordon in his retirement from pulling the express. But aside from that, it ended again with a whimper. 4 out of 10. So I've covered Wilbert's and I've covered Christopher's. Now it's time to put them into order. Okay, here we go. My rankings. Number 42, New Little Engine. Number 41, Thomas and the Fat Controller's Engines. Number 40, James the Red Engine. Number 39, Wilbert the Forest Engine. Number 38, Great Little Engines. Number 37, Tank Engine Thomas again. Number 36, Thomas and his friends. Number 35, James and the Diesel Engines. Number 34, Thomas and Victoria. Number 33, more about Thomas the Tank Engine. Number 32, Thomas and the Great Railway Show. Number 31, Toby, Trucks and Trouble. Number 30, The 3 Railway Engines. Number 29, Thomas and the Twins. Number 28, Branch Line Engines. Number 27, Thomas the Tank Engine. Number 26, 4 Little Engines. Number 25, Thomas Comes Home. Number 24, Really Useful Engines. Number 23, Tramway Engines. Number 22, Jock the New Engine. Number 21, The 8 Famous Engines. Number 20, The Twin Engines. Number 19, Troublesome Engines. Number 18, The Little Old Engines. Number 17, Toby the Tram Engine. Number 16, Henry the Green Engine. Number 15, Henry and the Express. Number 14, Stepney the Bluebell Engine. Number 13, Percy the Small Engine. Number 12, Edward the Blue Engine. Number 11, Gallant Old Engine. Number 10, Gordon the High Speed Engine. Number 9, Gordon the Big Engine. Number 8, Duck and the Diesel Engine. Number 7, Mainline Engines. Number 6, Oliver the Western Engine. Number 5, Small Railway Engines. Number 4, Enterprising Engines. Number 3, Duke the Lost Engine. Number 2, Very Old Engines. And number 1, Mountain Engines. And that is my ranking video of books 1 to 42 of the Railway series by Wilbert and Christopher Awdry. I know that there is a lot on that you will not agree with, and that's perfectly fine. It's the one thing that makes the Thomas fandom so unique. Let me know in the comments what order you would put the Railway series books in. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep on chugging.